It was February 14th, 1942, and the world was caught in the chaos of global conflict. The Second World War had already been raging for several years, and the United States, still reeling from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, had entered the fray. The war was not just about battling for land and air superiority. It was a fight for technological dominance. In the laboratories of Harvard University, far removed from the front lines, a seemingly small discovery was about to unleash a new form of warfare that would forever change the way the world fought wars. In the basement of Converse Laboratory, Professor Louis Frederick Pfizer, a 42-year-old organic chemistry professor, was immersed in his work. A scientist of considerable repute, Pfizer was known for his studies on vitamin K, blood coagulation, and synthetic rubber. These were areas that promised scientific advancements with the potential to help millions. But the war was demanding more than just the advancement of science for the betterment of humanity. It was asking for destruction, for weapons that could bring about a decisive victory over the enemy. Though Pfizer had initially hesitated to contribute to the creation of chemical weapons, the immense pressure from the military and his duty to his country left him with little choice. His expertise in chemistry, particularly in organic compounds, now had a far darker application. Pfizer's initial reluctance toward chemical warfare stemmed from his personal moral compass. Like many scientists at the time, he had been content working on medical advancements, but when President Roosevelt personally called for assistance with the war effort, Pfizer could not turn his back. He, like many others in his position, found himself caught in a storm of national duty and personal ethics. This conflict would ultimately lead to one of the most infamous and controversial discoveries in modern history. Pfizer was working on synthetic rubber as part of an ongoing project. With war production ramping up, rubber became a critical material for everything from tires to military vehicles. The United States was heavily reliant on foreign sources of rubber, particularly from the East Indies, but those supplies were rapidly being cut off by Japanese forces. Pfizer's task was to develop an alternative, a synthetic version that could be produced at home. However, while working with various chemical compounds, Pfizer stumbled upon something that would have far greater consequences than simply making synthetic rubber. One day, while testing a combination of aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate, Pfizer ignited the mixture, not expecting anything extraordinary. To his surprise, the reaction produced a gel-like substance that burned with intense heat. This substance was thick, sticky, and almost applesauce-like in consistency. But what made this gel stand out wasn't just its strange texture. It was its ability to burn at a high temperature and, most disturbingly, adhere to surfaces once it was ignited. It didn't explode or burn in the way traditional fuels did. Instead, the gel clung to anything it touched and burned at temperatures ranging from 800 degrees to 1000 degrees, 6 times hotter than thermite, a highly reactive material known for its ability to melt steel. For Pfizer, this wasn't just an intriguing chemical reaction. This was something far more dangerous. The gel wasn't like ordinary gasoline, which ignites in a fireball and quickly dies out. This was a weaponized gel capable of being directed into specific locations, caves, bunkers, and enemy positions. Unlike traditional firebombs, this gel didn't just explode, it stuck to its target, burning intensely and relentlessly. The implications were immediate, and Pfizer couldn't ignore them. At the time, the Japanese military was entrenched on countless islands across the Pacific, each one fortified with extensive systems of caves, tunnels, and bunkers. These strongholds had proven impervious to conventional bombing raids. The Japanese soldiers had adopted a no-surrender mentality and had prepared for defense in depth. Entire mountains were carved into fortresses of concrete and rock. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments bounced off the surface of these bunkers, making it difficult for the United States to secure a foothold in the Pacific. In light of this, Pfizer realized that his chemical breakthrough could be the key to breaking Japan's defense. In the initial moments of recognizing what he had discovered, Pfizer's mind raced. Could this gel-like substance be used as a weapon? Could it breach the Japanese fortifications that had thwarted every previous attempt at invasion? And if it could, what would be the moral cost of using such a weapon? These questions would weigh heavily on Pfizer's conscience in the years to come, but at that moment he was still caught up in the science. The weaponization potential of his discovery was undeniable. It was not just the fact that the gel burned at such a high temperature that made it so lethal, it was the adhesive nature of the gel, its ability to cling to surfaces and burn relentlessly. Napalm, as the substance would soon be called, had the potential to reach deep into caves and bunkers where the Japanese soldiers were holed up. Water and dirt couldn't extinguish it. It would burn through anything in its path, including human flesh, equipment and fortification. Pfizer immediately documented his findings in his laboratory journal. He carefully recorded the chemical properties of the gel and its reaction when exposed to heat. The substance was a combination of aluminum salts that, when mixed with gasoline, transformed into a sticky, flammable substance that could be projected onto enemy position. It was clear that this substance could be used in a new form of incendiary bombing, one that was far more precise, devastating and difficult to defend against than anything previously employed. Pfizer didn't realize it at the time, but his discovery would soon be in the hands of military leaders. His invention would not just be tested in the laboratory but in the brutal trenches of war. The potential for napalm was immediately apparent to the military, and they wasted no time in taking the chemical into production. This would mark the beginning of a new chapter in chemical warfare. Pfizer's heart must have been heavy when he reached for the telephone that day. He called the military authorities, reporting the breakthrough. What started as a routine experiment had morphed into something that could shape the course of the war. It was a creation that would change the nature of combat forever. It would soon be deployed in a way that Pfizer, a scientist with a passion for progress, could never have anticipated. Napalm's transformation, a weapon born in the laboratory. Napalm, once just a simple chemical compound, now had a terrifying purpose. The military saw its potential immediately. By mid-April 1942, the United States was already gearing up for its first field tests of napalm. The American military, struggling against entrenched Japanese forces on Pacific islands, needed a weapon that could penetrate deep underground bunkers and burn through the strongest fortifications. Production facilities were quickly established to create this new incendiary weapon. X Products, a chemical manufacturing company, began producing large quantities of napalm. By 1943, the United States had already produced tens of thousands of gallons of the substance, and the first field tests were conducted. By the time 1944 rolled around, the number had skyrocketed to millions. The M69 incendiary bomb, designed specifically for napalm deployment, weighed just 6.2 pounds, but had the potential to destroy entire enemy positions. Packed into clusters, these bombs could be dropped from high altitudes or delivered by flame tanks. The weapon was compact, effective, and terrifying in its simplicity. The military need for such a weapon was clear. In places like Tinian, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders had built caves and bunkers that could resist everything from artillery shells to naval bombardment. The Japanese had proven time and again that they were willing to fight to the death and never surrender, even in the face of overwhelming American forces. Napalm provided the American military with a weapon that could break the defense lines, burn out the entrenched enemy, and force them to surrender or die. But for Pfizer, the victory came at a cost. As the success of napalm in the Pacific campaign began to unfold, Pfizer's role in its development became less of a scientific achievement and more of a haunting legacy. He had created a weapon that would become synonymous with destruction and suffering, a weapon that would burn cities, villages, and human beings. And yet, as he looked out of his laboratory window, he couldn't help but wonder, had he done the right thing? In the spring of 1942, as the shadows of global conflict stretched further across the world, the United States military found itself in desperate need of a new weapon, one that could overcome the tenacious and unyielding Japanese defenses in the Pacific. The Japanese had turned their island strongholds into fortresses, each one meticulously fortified with deep underground bunkers, caves, and reinforced concrete positions. The defenders fought with an unmatched ferocity, refusing to surrender, and willing to die for every inch of ground they occupied. The result was clear. Conventional bombing, artillery, and naval bombardment had proven ineffective. The American military needed something more. Napalm, a simple chemical compound born in a Harvard basement, would become that something. At first, Professor Louis Pfizer could hardly fathom the full potential of what he had created. It was one thing to witness the extraordinary heat and adhesive properties of his new chemical in the controlled environment of a laboratory. It was another to imagine it being used in the chaos of war. Yet once the military saw the substance's potential to burn through concrete and metal, to penetrate the very fortifications that had stymied every other attempt to take Japanese-controlled islands, there was no turning back. Napalm was going to war. The first real-world test of napalm came not in a remote military testing ground, but in the most unlikely of places. Harvard University's soccer field. In the summer of 1942, Pfizer and his team of military officials gathered for an experimental demonstration. The test was simple in its execution, but had consequences far beyond anything anyone could have predicted. The American military had decided to test the newly developed incendiary gel in a realistic setting, to see if it could perform under more unpredictable battlefield-like conditions. Harvard's soccer field, typically a place for students to play, was transformed into a war zone of sorts. On the field, a shallow pool of water was prepared, with 45 pounds of napalm placed inside. The Cambridge Fire Department, always on standby for such events, watched nervously, uncertain of what would happen next. Pfizer, armed with only the most basic of tools, and his understanding of the chemical's properties, prepared to ignite the napalm with a white phosphorus igniter. The experiment began. When the ignition occurred, the results were nothing short of astonishing. The napalm immediately ignited in a violent flash, surging up into the air, then splashing into the surrounding water, where it continued to burn relentlessly. The substance didn't burn in the way conventional fire did. It didn't explode in a giant fireball, nor did it flicker out. Instead, the napalm clung to everything it touched: the grass, the concrete, and even the firefighters' equipment. The gel continued to burn at a temperature that was 6 times hotter than thermite, easily melting metal and causing the grass beneath it to catch fire and spread. The fire department, which had initially been prepared to deal with an ordinary fire, now faced something much more insidious. Pfizer's test was a success, but it was also an unsettling revelation. The psychological impact of seeing something burn in this new, unnatural way was not lost on those who witnessed it. The tennis players who were practicing nearby fled in a panic, shocked by the sight of this new, uncontainable fire. This fire didn't follow the typical rules. It didn't need oxygen to survive. It didn't follow any conventional rules of combustion. The napalm had a horrifying resilience, sticking to the environment and continuing to burn until it had exhausted its fuel. Water, the most common way to extinguish fire, was useless. The gel continued to burn. This was no ordinary incendiary weapon. It was a game changer. The adhesive nature of napalm made it different from anything that had come before. Bombs that exploded in fireballs were unpredictable, and they didn't always hit their mark. Napalm, however, could be directed exactly where it was needed. Its precision made it the perfect weapon to tackle the Japanese fortifications in the Pacific, bunkers, caves, and pillboxes that had proven to be impervious to conventional bombardment. The immediate success of the test was a clear indication that napalm could be used not just as a weapon of indiscriminate destruction, but as a tool for tactical advantage. The military's reaction to Pfizer's test was swift. The American forces were engaged in a battle that was not just about capturing territory but breaking the resolve of an enemy that refused to surrender. On islands like Iwo Jima, the Japanese had dug in deeply, carving miles of tunnels and fortifications that made traditional attacks nearly impossible. The American forces knew that to break these lines they needed a weapon that could reach deep into the earth, something that could not just blow open the doors of a bunker but burn everything within it. Within months of the successful test, production of napalm was scaled up. The Nurex Products Company was tasked with creating large quantities of napalm, and by the spring of 1943 the United States military had developed a new kind of bomb, the M69 incendiary bomb, specifically designed for napalm deployment. These bombs were small, weighing only 6.2 pounds, but when dropped from aircraft they unleashed a devastating stream of burning gel, capable of igniting 15 feet of target area. The M69s were packed into cluster bombs that could be released from high altitudes, spreading over large target zones. These bombs would soon be used in combat, and the results were staggering. Napalm's first combat use, Tinian and Saipan. By mid-1944, napalm was no longer just an experimental substance. It was a weapon deployed in actual combat. The first use of napalm on a large scale came during the Allied invasion of the Mariana Islands, a critical campaign aimed at securing airfields and naval bases that would bring the American military within striking distance of Japan. The Tinian and Saipan Islands, both heavily fortified by the Japanese, were pivotal to this effort. The Japanese on Tinian had created elaborate defenses, including an underground network of tunnels and bunkers which had been carved into the island's coral hills. These fortifications were designed to resist aerial bombardment and artillery, making traditional military tactics almost ineffective. The Japanese had proven themselves unwilling to surrender, often preferring death over capture. In this environment, napalm was about to prove its worth. On July 22, 1944, American bombers flew over Tinian, each carrying M69 incendiary bombs filled with napalm. As the bombs fell from the sky, something unlike any bombing campaign in history occurred. Instead of the explosions of high-explosive bombs which produced large blasts but lacked precision, napalm spread across the island like a wave of fire. The incendiary gel stuck to everything, burning through the enemy's fortifications, flowing into the openings of bunkers and caves. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had a weapon that could reach deep into the heart of the Japanese defenses. As the bombs exploded across the island, Marines who were stationed on nearby Saipan watched in awe and horror. They saw orange flames rip across the landscape, engulfing everything in their path. The Japanese soldiers who had dug themselves deep into the island's rock were now helpless against this new weapon. They had been trained to fight in their bunkers, but napalm wasn't just a fire that could be extinguished. It was unquenchable. The gel stuck to soldiers' bodies, their weapons, and their positions, turning the fortified island into a living hell. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was devastating. Reports from American Marines and soldiers who witnessed the aftermath described soldiers coming out of holes, their bodies burning from the napalm, trying to roll on the ground to put out the flames, but only spreading the fire further. Within days, the U.S. military was requesting napalm strikes before every assault, knowing it would neutralize enemy positions in minutes. By August 1, 1944, Tinian was captured. Of the 9,000 Japanese defenders, only 13 survived. Napalm had proven not only to be effective but also to be a game-changer. Its ability to burn through the most advanced and well-fortified defenses in a matter of minutes set it apart from anything the military had used before. By the summer of 1944, napalm had already proven its worth on the battlefields of the Pacific. Its success on islands like Tinian and Saipan had shown the world its devastating power. However, the island of Iwo Jima, a strategic objective for the United States military, would become the ultimate proving ground for napalm's full potential. It was here that napalm would not only prove itself as a weapon of fire and destruction, but also as a harbinger of psychological devastation for both the American and Japanese forces. The Battle for Iwo Jima, napalm's crucible. The Battle of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945, and it became one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The island, located about 750 miles south of the Japanese home islands, was strategically important for the United States because it would provide an ideal base for launching attacks on Japan's main island. It was heavily fortified with underground tunnels, bunkers, and a network of caves that the Japanese had carved into the volcanic rock of the island. The Japanese garrison, led by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was determined to fight to the death. Kuribayashi had already vowed that his troops would make the Americans pay dearly for every inch of ground. He had ordered his men to dig in and resist until the very end, believing that it was better to die for the emperor than to surrender. Napalm had already been used with success in earlier battles, but Iwo Jima presented an entirely new level of challenge. The Japanese defenders were dug in deep underground, making it difficult for conventional artillery or bombs to reach them. On top of that, Iwo Jima's terrain, with its steep volcanic slopes and rugged caves, made it an incredibly difficult place to assault. The Americans quickly realized that the standard military tactics which had worked on other islands would not be sufficient. This was the final push to break the Japanese resolve. The role of napalm in Iwo Jima. As the Marines landed on the island, they were greeted with intense resistance, as expected. What wasn't expected was the sheer ferocity and resilience of the Japanese defenders. The American forces faced a deep, interlocking network of fortifications that required new tactics. The answer was clear: napalm, the same incendiary gel that had previously been used to destroy enemy positions, was now adapted to clear the underground labyrinth that the Japanese had created. In this pivotal battle, flame tanks, specially modified Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers, were deployed in large numbers. These Zippo tanks, as the Marines affectionately called them, had been designed to project thick streams of burning napalm directly into enemy positions. Unlike traditional artillery or bombs, which would often miss or only partially destroy fortifications, the flame tanks could precisely target caves, bunkers, and underground passages, forcing the enemy out into the open or burning them alive within the fortifications. The psychological impact of napalm was immediate. The Japanese soldiers, who had spent weeks and months preparing to defend their positions, now faced a new and terrifying threat. The tanks would advance through the island, spraying jet streams of fire into the caves and fortifications. As the fire reached into these underground passages, it would burn through the rock, causing immense thermal shock to the concrete and steel reinforcements. The heat was so intense that it melted steel and cracked concrete. For the Japanese soldiers inside, there was no escape. Those who survived the initial flames were often trapped as the fires continued to spread. Escape was impossible, and the only option was to fight or die in the flames. The Marines who witnessed these attacks recalled seeing Japanese soldiers trying to flee from their bunkers, their bodies ablaze, but they were often quickly shot by American infantry. The flame tanks were instrumental in clearing entrenched positions, allowing the Marines to advance. As Iwo Jima's defenders were slowly burned out of their strongholds, American forces were able to advance and secure key parts of the island. However, the battle was still far from over. The psychological toll on both the Americans and the Japanese was staggering. The Marines who fought in this battle had never faced anything like the hellish inferno created by napalm. The fear of being burned alive or trapped in a bunker with no escape was enough to break the spirit of many men. For the Japanese, it was worse. Napalm didn't just kill, it humiliated. Japanese soldiers had been trained to die for their emperor and to resist surrender at all costs. But napalm didn't offer them the dignity of a swift death. It was an agonizing and indescribable way to die. This aspect of the weapon, its psychological terror, was something that Fraser, the scientist who had created napalm, could never have fully anticipated. By March 26, 1945, after over a month of brutal fighting, Iwo Jima was declared secure. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, only 1,083 survived. The battle had cost the United States 6,800 Marines, with thousands more wounded. But despite the heavy casualties, napalm had accelerated the assault and reduced the time it took to neutralize the enemy defenses. The effectiveness of napalm had been proven beyond a doubt. The battle for Okinawa, napalm's evolution. After the battle for Iwo Jima, American forces turned their attention to the island of Okinawa, which would prove to be the largest and bloodiest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Okinawa was vital for the United States, because it would serve as a launching point for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. The Japanese military, however, was determined to fight to the last man. Okinawa was heavily fortified with many of the same types of underground bunkers and caves that had made Iwo Jima so difficult to capture. By now, napalm had become an essential tool for breaking through these defenses. The use of flame tanks was now widespread, and napalm was being deployed in increasing quantities across the island. However, the Japanese defenders on Okinawa had learned from previous battles. They had reinforced their positions, dug deeper into the mountainous terrain, and created fire breaks to try to prevent napalm from spreading. But it was no use. Napalm's devastating ability to cling to surfaces and burn at unimaginable temperatures proved unstoppable. American forces used flame tanks to attack cave systems, burn through machine gun nests, and neutralize artillery positions. Marine flamethrower squads followed behind the tanks, ensuring that no position was left untouched. This two-pronged assault made it almost impossible for the Japanese to fight back effectively. The psychological impact on the Japanese soldiers was overwhelming. Many of them began to surrender, unable to withstand the fury of the flame. The firebombing of Japan, napalm's most terrifying application. As the battle for Okinawa raged on, the United States began preparing for its final push into the Japanese home island. The islands of Kyushu and Honshu were heavily fortified, with hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers ready to resist. The American military knew that conventional assaults would result in an unacceptably high number of casualties, so they began planning for the largest and most devastating air campaign in history. In March 1945, the United States began massive firebombing raids on Japanese cities using napalm. The firebombing of Tokyo, which occurred on March 9, 1945, would become one of the most catastrophic bombing raids ever conducted. The United States B-29 superfortresses, stripped of their defensive guns to carry more bombs, targeted Tokyo's residential districts where wooden houses and paper walls were highly vulnerable to fire. The first wave of bombers dropped 1,165 tons of incendiaries, creating a firestorm that would devastate Tokyo. Within 30 minutes, individual fires merged into a massive inferno, creating a firestorm that burned for hours. The heat from the fire reached up to 1,100 bpd, hot enough to melt steel and vaporize concrete. The firestorm created winds exceeding 100 mph, sucking oxygen from bomb shelters and feeding the flames with fresh air. The air was so hot that the Sumida River evaporated in the heat. Tokyo's fire department was overwhelmed, and fire trucks melted under the intense heat. By the time the raid ended, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. The death toll was devastating. 87,500 civilians were killed, though Japanese sources suggest the number could have been over 100,000. The destruction was so complete that the city was rendered uninhabitable for months. The psychological impact of napalm was now visible on a global scale. Napalm had gone from a strategic weapon used in individual battles to a global tool of destruction. With the end of World War II in 1945, the world was left to grapple with the devastation caused by the war and the technological innovations that had emerged from the conflict. Among the most potent and controversial of these innovations was napalm. Developed in the quiet labs of Harvard University, this seemingly simple gel, a mixture of aluminum palmitate, aluminum naponate, and gasoline, had become one of the most powerful tools of destruction the world had ever seen. But as the dust settled after Japan's surrender, questions surrounding the moral implications of napalm and the psychological toll on those who had witnessed or used it began to arise. The final days of World War II, the last stages of deployment, as the war in the Pacific reached its final stages, the use of napalm reached its most devastating application. The firebombing campaigns, most notably the raid on Tokyo in March 1945, became a central element of the United States' strategy to defeat Japan. Although the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki often dominate the narrative of Japan's surrender, the napalm bombings played a critical and often overlooked role in weakening Japan's ability to continue fighting. The firebombing raids, which involved the deployment of B-29 bombers loaded with cluster bombs containing napalm, were instrumental in breaking the will of the Japanese people and military. These raids obliterated entire cities, burned millions of civilians alive, and destroyed the core of Japan's industrial and civilian infrastructure. The psychological trauma experienced by both the Japanese civilians and the soldiers who faced the weapon was profound. By the time August 15, 1945 arrived, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, napalm had already effectively devastated Japan's ability to wage war. In Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other industrial cities, large areas had been reduced to ash. The urban areas were no longer viable for civilian life, and the infrastructure needed to continue the war effort had been destroyed. In many ways, the firebombing campaigns, which lasted for months, had inflicted more damage than the two atomic bombings combined. Despite the horrific nature of the atomic bombs, it was napalm's systematic burning of Japan that had already crippled the country's industrial capacity and ability to resist. As Japan's cities burned, The psychological impact on both American and Japanese forces was profound. For the Japanese civilians, napalm was a terrifying and relentless force. People who survived the initial fires often died from burns, suffocation, or being trapped in buildings that were consumed by flames. Many who managed to escape the fires were left homeless, with their lives shattered and cities reduced to rubble. For the American soldiers and Marines who had used napalm in battle, the experience was equally traumatic. Many of the men who fought in the Pacific Theater, especially those who had witnessed the effects of flame tanks, flamethrowers, and napalm strikes, struggled with the moral implications of using such a weapon even though they understood its strategic necessity. The idea of burning alive a human being, no matter the enemy, weighed heavily on many soldiers. Napalm in the post-war era. A weapon with no retreat. As the war ended, napalm did not fade into history. It found new uses. The Cold War that followed the defeat of the Axis powers brought new conflicts to the forefront. Napalm, now perfected and mass-produced, became a standard weapon for the United States military in the Korean War, 1950–1953, and Vietnam War, 1955–1975. The Korean War marked one of the first instances of napalm's continued use in the post-World War II era. As American forces fought the North Korean and Chinese troops, they utilized napalm in large quantities to destroy supply lines, fortified positions, and enemy strongholds. The results were similar to what had been achieved in the Pacific: widespread devastation of enemy positions. But napalm was not confined to military targets. The civilian cost was high, as cities and villages were caught in the path of napalm's relentless destruction. However, it was during the Vietnam War that napalm would once again gain international infamy. The United States used napalm extensively in Vietnam, not only to destroy enemy positions, but also to destroy the dense jungles that served as cover for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. Napalm was used to clear jungle areas, burn villages, and strike at the heart of guerrilla warfare, but the horrific consequences of its use were impossible to ignore. The psychological and moral impact of napalm's use. The psychological toll napalm took on the American soldiers who used it was immense. The images of villages being consumed by fire, of people burned alive, and of entire populations being wiped out by firestorms created an emotional and moral burden that soldiers would carry with them long after the war. Many veterans reported experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of witnessing the devastating power of napalm. Despite the strategic advantage it provided, the emotional cost was high. For the Vietnamese, napalm was a tool of terror. Villages that were accused of supporting the Viet Cong were often destroyed in napalm attacks, leaving thousands of civilians dead or severely burned. The attacks were indiscriminate, with entire communities being wiped out. The famous image of a young girl running down the street in Vietnam, her skin burned by a napalm attack, became one of the most iconic and haunting symbols of the war. Kim Phuc, the girl in the photo, later became an outspoken advocate for peace and an opponent of the use of napalm. The image of this child, burned beyond recognition, shocked the world and sparked an international outcry against the use of napalm. While napalm had been developed for the express purpose of destroying military targets, its use in civilian areas raised ethical questions that still linger. Many argued that napalm should be classified as a weapon of mass destruction, one that caused indiscriminate suffering and long-term environmental damage. Napalm's role in modern warfare and international law. By the time the Vietnam War ended, napalm had already become a symbol of the excesses of modern warfare. It was a weapon that caused unprecedented destruction, and its legacy would influence international law. As the horrors of Vietnam became more widely understood, pressure grew to place restrictions on the use of incendiary weapons like napalm. In 1980, the United Nations adopted the Protocol on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Incendiary Weapons, which aimed to limit the use of weapons like napalm that cause excessive harm to civilians. While the protocol did not completely ban napalm, it imposed strict limitations on its use in civilian areas. Despite the growing international calls for regulation, napalm and similar incendiary weapons have continued to be used in various conflicts. The lessons learned from the Vietnam War and the humanitarian outcry against napalm led to stricter controls, but the technology of fire-based weapons remains a part of military arsenals around the world. The legacy of napalm, a weapon of total destruction. Today, napalm is no longer used in the same widespread way it once was, but its legacy remains a cautionary tale about the moral consequences of scientific innovation. For Louis Pfizer, the scientist who first created napalm, the weapon became a burden he could not escape. After World War II, Pfizer returned to his academic work at Harvard, but he could not forget the impact of his discovery. In the Vietnam War, as television broadcasts showed the devastation caused by napalm, Pfizer's conscience began to weigh heavily. He famously wrote to President Richard Nixon in 1972, urging for an international ban on napalm, though the letter received little response. Pfizer, like many others involved in the creation of weapons of mass destruction, found himself questioning the true cost of scientific progress. His invention had brought an end to the war and saved countless American lives, but it had also inflicted unimaginable suffering on both soldiers and civilians. The moral ambiguity of his creation lingered throughout his later life, and the legacy of napalm continues to spark debates on the ethics of warfare. As the world moves further into the 21st century, the question of justifiable warfare and the use of weapons like napalm continues to be a source of controversy. While weapons technology has advanced in countless ways, the fundamental question remains: how far should humanity go in the pursuit of victory? The legacy of napalm serves as a stark reminder of the balance between military necessity and the moral cost of victory.